Yeah, I encourage anyone who's thinking of doing this to make sure they have a good guide and
Yeah.
somebody who can help them. And because the other thing that comes out of being in a very well regulated environment with somebody you trust, a guide or a shaman, is that you can really let go. And I think that's really important, to
Mm.
surrender to the
Yeah.
experience. To the extent you fight what's going on in your head as you feel yourself dying or going crazy or melting or all the different things that happen to people, if you fight that and you cling to that ego to hold on to it, that's when you're going to get really anxious and paranoid.
Mm.
If there's this push pull between the medicine and you, if you succumb and just surrender to what's happening, I'm dying, I'm going to let it happen, I'm going to open that doorway, I'm going to go into that cave, whatever it is, or I'm going to embrace that monster coming at me, um, you will be much better off, and it will morph into a very positive experience.
Yeah.
And that is hard to remember in the midst of it, but
Yeah.
good preparation will tell you, and a good guide will say, surrender to what's happening.
Yeah.
Relax your mind and float downstream, as John Lennon put it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I resisted and was in all sorts of trouble until I stopped. And like you say, changed like that. I mean, actually, I think that's a good way of approaching pretty much all of our internal experience. We're so used to avoiding and suppressing and denying and all that kind of, and distracting with our phones. Actually, surrendering to what is in the given moment, it's, I mean, one of the best approaches to certainly our
Totally
internal
agree.
life.
And it is also the same lesson of meditation, right?
Yeah.
Mindfulness is, don't fight what's going on in your head. Just watch it go by and let it go by, and surrender.
You spoke about, you mentioned the ego and melting and dying and all that kind of stuff. And you had a nice line, I think, in the book where you talk about, I'd always felt identical to my ego, and which is the default state for
Most of us,
for
yeah.
99%, certainly of Western society. We think the ego is who we are. And then you go into and you do this experience. And in your case, the ego gets blown into, what was it, billions or
Post-it
thousands of
notes,
blue Post-it notes.
blue Post-it notes, a whole detonation of self into Post-it notes that then kind of, fell like snow to the floor and formed this pool of blue paint. And that was me. That was my ego.
Yeah.
It's
Except it
very
wasn't you. Yeah.
well. It was part of me, and I
Yeah.
realized, and that was an important. Like, I survived the death of the ego, and that tells you something. That it tells you you're not identical. There is some space between you. That there is a self that is not egotistical, because the self from which I observe this experience, this catastrophe, you might say, was completely cool with it. It was fine. It was, perfect equanimity. And that gave me this sense that I didn't have to listen to my ego all the time, that it was one voice, an important voice. It helped me get a lot of things done, but it wasn't me. Or there was another me that was less grasping, less selfish, less self-interested.
Yeah.
And that was, that stayed with me. That's really
Yeah.
stayed with me. That was a very important insight. And that could have been a frightening experience, watching yourself, because that was me. That puddle on the ground was what was left of me. But I had a very good guide, and she had prepared me for this. And I was able to let go and observe it with this incredible objectivity.
Yeah. So, uh, two questions then. First of all, just briefly on that, the fact that so many people who've been given a terminal diagnosis have gone through psychedelic therapy and it's given them a sense of peace about dying. Um, how closely related is that to the death of the ego and the fact that there is something, like you say, that's totally cool with it, that's left standing? So
Yeah.
that's part one. And then, Michael, part two, if you can just talk as well about what you've learned about the relationship between the ego and the default mode network in the brain.
Yeah. So with regard to the people who were struggling with cancer, having an experience of ego dissolution, I think, was very important to changing their mindset. They One of the things that happens is when your ego dissolves, you feel less separate from other things. The ego builds walls, right? It's a defensive structure in large part, and when those walls come down, you merge with whatever is larger than you, and you feel very connected to the natural world, to other people. And many of the people who describe their experiences, the cancer patients, would talk about feeling like part of nature, part of the soil. I went into the soil and I was taken up by the plants, and that there was a kind of afterlife, and you know, not necessarily as conscious beings, but they were incorporated in something larger than themselves. So they saw their death less as an end than as part of a process. Many of them, and that was enormously reassuring to people. Some of them had very specific sense of what would happen after they died. They would talk about a great plane of consciousness stretching out indefinitely that they would join. That I think the death of the ego, the fact that the death of the ego does not obliterate you and you still have some perspective, suggests that something will survive the death of the ego. And it's sort of a death rehearsal. And many people come out of it feeling much more reassured, which I find fascinating. And, I would ask the researchers, so what are we, are you selling an illusion or delusion to people? And they would say, well, these are products of their own minds. Not everybody has these. And no, we're not selling them a delusion. This is what they're coming up with. And others would say, what's so bad about that? If it allows people to die with more equanimity. So, you can regard that from several different perspectives. In terms of the default mode network and the ego, to the extent the ego has an address in the brain, it appears to be this particular network. This is a network. It's called default mode because it's very active when you're not doing anything else, when you're not on a task. It was kind of discovered when they were putting people in fMRI machines to look at brain function and correlate brain function with a subjective experience, that when you said, I just want a baseline, don't do anything, don't think about anything, this was the network that acted up. So it's kind of the default, it's where the brain goes. It involves a couple structures in the brain, the prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and some deeper, older areas having to do with memory. But it's the part of the brain that appears to be involved in what's called theory of mind, our ability to imagine the perspective of other people, that other people are conscious, not just us, and also the narrative self, the story we construct moment by moment of who we are.
Yeah.
And how we fold information and what happens to us into that story. It's also involved in time travel. And if you think about it, without a sense of past and future, you don't have an identity, right? I mean, identity is everything that's happened to you before and your objectives for the future. So it seems very involved with the construction of the ego and our sense of self. And what's really interesting is in some of the research done, and this is done by putting people in fMRI machines while they're tripping. And we should applaud these volunteers for being willing to do that, because I can't imagine.
It's the last place you want to be.
Yeah, that their default mode network is deactivated substantially during the psychedelic experience. And in fact, there were correlations between the degree to which the default mode network was silenced and the degree to which people had what's called a mystical experience, which is that experience of transcending the sense of self and becoming part of something larger. So if you can get the default mode network offline, you're going to have that feeling of what's called unitive consciousness, that you're part of something larger. You're not defended by this thing called the ego.
Yeah.
And you can get there other ways. Mystical experience is achievable through meditation and fasting and vision quests. There's a whole history in the West and the East of transcending self. And probably these are all technologies for quieting the default mode network.
And actually, even more mundane stuff. I mean, I talk about sport quite a lot. People talk about flow.
Yeah,
in the flow. You're not thinking about past and future. You're just part of the
you're there.
universal
You're in the
flow.
present.
Exactly. I mean, pretty
And you're
much
not
any
thinking
time.
about ego
Yeah.
either.
Yeah.
You're so absorbed in the task that you're not judging. Am I doing well? Am I doing badly? What do people think of what I'm doing and how I look? No, you're in it.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if this research has been done, but I would guess that during states of flow, the default mode network is deactivated.
Well, yeah. I mean, I've spoken to plenty of people who say that, during a seminal or key moment, of sporting victory or sporting heroism, they said there was no me present. There was just a
Yes,
knowing of it, which is the same as in that
it
psychedelic experience.
is.
There was the knowing of those blue Post-it notes for you, and
Yeah,
those blue Post-it notes were the me, weren't they? I mean, that's it, right? And the
that's it.
default mode network, when you say, when people are sort of sat there not thinking about anything else, and they're very associated, are they not, with self-referential thoughts? I.e., you
Oh,
alluded to
yeah.
them. What do people think of me, or how am I doing? Blah blah blah, all that kind of stuff. Where we're the star of our own movie.
Yeah. No, the default mode network is definitely involved in self-reflection. And self-reflection is really kind of what goes away in flow states and in psychedelic states and in meditative states. I
Yeah,
mean, meditation is all about transcending that sense of self
yeah.
and being part of a kind of more universal consciousness.